I grew up in a Baptist church. I grew up in we weren't just nominal Baptist. We were very, very active, okay? So my mother had us in Sunday school. We were in training union. We were in the choir. We were in every organization, in every function, everything. And I grew up knowing the Bible, reading the Bible. It was something that was part of our family. But you can know the Bible, you can experience the Bible, you can talk the Bible, you can do all of these things and still not be a real believer. I had a belief, and if anybody came to me and said, "Are you a Christian?" I'd say immediately yes. But there came a point in my life when I was 28 years old that I actually became a believer. I was working in a refinery, and I was working on a truck with two other men. The driver of the truck was a deacon in the Baptist church, and I was reading the Bible. And this gentleman said to me, he said, "Good, you can't go by that Bible. You have to go by what your pastor says or your church says." And I said, "No, I don't believe that. I don't accept that. I don't know all that this book says, but whatever it says from this point, this is what I'm going to go by the scripture." And so immediately my life began to change. I began I could not stop reading from that point. I kept on reading, but in the first week, I had this dream. Now, I've had lots of dreams in my life, but this dream I knew was from God. I didn't remember that much about the dream, but the next morning when I woke up, I knew that in the dream I was going to be working in a life-size model of the temple. I didn't know anything about the temple, but I began to start to study, and I had no idea of going in the ministry or any of these things. I started studying. People started inviting me to come and talk about the various festivals, to talk about all kinds of things. But that's been about 40 some odd years ago. And I went to Israel. First off, I wrote a book called Rosh Hashanah and the Messianic Kingdom to Come. That book was somebody sent it to her. We printed on a copy machine because we didn't have any money. And they sent this printed copy to TBN. Now, generally when something goes to TBN, it's put in a warehouse. Somehow it got on Jan Crouch's desk. She ended up, they were having a special guest, Benny Hinn. And Benny Hinn's flight, he was circling around Los Angeles. And they couldn't land. They didn't have a guest. They didn't have any other guests that night. And she had just got my book and came out and started reading. She said, "We don't know who this man is," but they started reading. It's about the festivals. It was about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the coming of the Messiah. And so, people called me and they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to do anything." About 2 weeks later, they invited Benny Hinn back, and exactly the same thing happened. There was cloud cover or whatever. His flight couldn't land, and they come out and they start reading my book again on the air. So they asked me, they said, again, they didn't know who I was, but if I was listening, to call. So people were calling me. I generally didn't watch TBN, but people started calling me, so I did call. And whoever I talked to didn't believe I was me. So I put it down, and people said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, at this point, I'm going to do nothing." About 2 days later, I got a call from Jan Crouch, and she said, "Can you be in Dallas tomorrow?" And so I went up to Dallas. They put me on. They gave me a program right on the air. They gave me a program. And so through that, I got to go on my first trip to Israel. And my goal in going, I wanted to learn everything I could about Israel, but in particular, I wanted to see the Temple Mount. I wanted to see the Temple Mount. I wanted to learn everything that I could about the temple. On their show, on the show that I was doing for them, I was telling people to support the Temple Institute. One of the main rabbis, he was one of their directors. They had had some Christian ministries that would say support the Temple Institute, and they never saw the money. Nothing would ever come in. So he decided to check us out. So he called my ministry number, talked to a lady that was working for us, and he said, I want to make a donation. And he didn't say who he was, where he was calling from. He said, I want to make a donation to the Temple Institute. What do I do? And she said, well, don't send the money to us. Here's their address. You need to mail the money directly to them. So when he heard, when I came to Israel, that I was in Jerusalem, and he sent for me to come and meet him. So we went to meet him, my wife and I, we went to meet him, and we became friends. And God began opening doors, and through him, I began to meet other rabbis, people that were working on the temple. I began to meet various archeologists like Idlat Mazar, Eli Shukron, Dan Bahat, different archeologists. And so more and more we were working, we began writing books, wrote a book called Discovering the Location of the Temple. Not that it was up on Mount Moriah, but when you were in the Temple Mount, the locations of where was the temple building on the Temple Mount? What are the other locations that are mentioned in Scripture, mentioned by Josephus, mentioned in various ancient documents, including the Mishnah and the Tosafot, rabbinical writings. And we began working with the archaeologists. We would take their information, take the information from the rabbis, from the rabbinical writings, and we began working to discover where the courtyards were, where the mikvaot or the immersion chambers were, where the restrooms were, and all of these things. And so over the years, when I would put together my research, I would call the rabbis and say, I'd like to have a meeting with you. They would set up a meeting, and we would go to Jerusalem, and we would do a presentation before them. Then they would come back and say, okay, we have questions. And can you do research, come back and do another presentation to us on these questions, things that we would bring up. We've had a number of discoveries from this, and at this point, we now can pinpoint precisely exactly where the temple building was. We know where the tunnel systems were. Now, these tunnel systems, it's not just we discover a tunnel system, but a tunnel system that is described in detail. For instance, I'll give you an example. You have, we're told in what's called Midot and Tamid. These are books of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah are going to be the decisions made by the Sanhedrin, the leading sages of that time, but the official court, high court, the Supreme Court. And they have a whole section of their writings that is called Kodashim, holy things. So they have one book that's called Midot, and that's measurements. In that, it describes the size of the Temple Mount. It describes the temple building, the altar, the slaughter area, various chambers that surround the inner courtyard, the court of the women, the outer court, goes into all these things. Now, within that, and also the tractate, the book called Tamid, which deals with the daily services, it tells us that the priests that are going to be on duty, they come and they stay in a building that adjoins to the inner courtyard. This building is called the Beit HaMoked. It means house of the hearth, because they had a fireplace that was inside the building to keep the priest warm at night when they slept during the winter. Now, in the night, the priest will get up early, well before daylight, and they have to go down and immerse themselves before they can put on the priestly garments and go in to serve. If, for any reason, if they had a discharge during the night, they now have an impurity and they cannot serve. Okay, so this chamber, this is an underground chamber. It's called in Hebrew the Beit HaTevilah. We're told that there was a toilet there was a fire there, and the priests that are clean will go down, immerse, and then come back up into the dorm, into the Beit HaMoked, wait till the ministry of the temple comes, knocks on the door, opens the door. If they've immersed, then they will be taken to do that day's service, okay? But if they're disqualified, it was a mystery, where did they go? Now, it says that there is a stairway that goes down from the dorm, and they go into a tunnel, and the tunnel winds this way and that, and comes to the underground mikvah, the underground immersion place. Back in 1865, an organization was founded in Great Britain, in London. Back in the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte had gone to Egypt. He sends back all kinds of treasures of Egypt to Paris in this archeological fervor. Even though they didn't even call it archaeology at the time, it breaks out. There is a desire to know about these things. Now, this was followed in 1834 by a British gentleman named Layard, who discovers ancient Nineveh. And he sends back to London all of these things. So the ancient artifacts is becoming very, very popular. And at this time in Jerusalem, and that was where people really want to hear about, was Jerusalem and the actual Holy Land, the land of the Bible. The Muslims under the Turks controlled the Temple Mount. They controlled Jerusalem. No non-Muslim was allowed to the Temple Mount at this time. But a very wealthy lady in Britain, she offered to give Jerusalem a brand new water system based on the condition that royal engineers could come and survey the existing water system. Well, it turned out that 90% of the water system was on the Temple Mount. So for this brief period of time, we have not only surveyors, they are the best. Charles Wilson, Wilson's Arch is named after him. Charles Warren, Warren's Gate, Warren's Shaft down in the city of David, they're all named after him. Conrad Schick. Conrad Schick was a German-Swiss architect, and he worked with them. Claude Condor, Lieutenant Claude Condor, comes and he does a survey of the whole land. So all of a sudden we have where they have details of all these massive cisterns on top of the Temple Mount. Now, they find tunnels. So they found on December the 8th, 1868, there was a rainstorm. And Charles Warren goes up on top of the Temple Mount, and there had been a cave-in exposing a tunnel that ran right along the northern side of the Muslim platform. Muslim platform is a quadrangular section that has the Dome of the Rock sitting on it. Now, Charles Warren also discovered, by tapping on the ground and tapping on the stones, he discovered a location that they believed there was a big chamber underneath. Charles Wilson, Captain Charles Wilson, had discovered another tunnel. So it's kind of hard without pictures, but if you can picture, we have this quadrangular section, and we have along the northern edge, we have this tunnel. We have another tunnel right here. And this tunnel, discovered by Wilson, it dead ends. If you were to keep on going this way, you'd be right under the Dome of the Rock, okay? The tunnel has been converted into a cistern by the Muslims, probably, maybe the Romans, maybe the Crusaders. But the tunnel had benches in it. And the tunnel actually would have extended all the way to the end of the Muslim platform, which means it would have intersected the tunnel that Charles Warren had discovered. Now, in the Mishnah, in Midot and Tamid, it says the disqualified priest went and sat with his brothers until the gates of the temple were open, and then he exited through a special gate that was called the Tati gate. Now, the Tati gate is going to be different shape from every other gate. There's a reason. Today, when we drive, if you see a red octagonal shaped sign, you know to stop. If you see a yellow sign and it is triangular, you know to yield, all right? So this gate, unlike all the other gates, the other gates have a doorpost, and a door jamb, a lintel, okay? And so this gate, though, had no lintel. It was shaped like this. We're told in the Mishnah that this gate served for no purpose, but they yet were told that the disqualified priest exited going through this gate. All right? Now, we were able to put everything together. From the Beit HaMoked over here, here's our dorm. There's a stairway, it comes down, and it takes you, what we believe, to this location that Charles Warren discovered, an underground chamber right outside of the holy perimeters that the temple would sit on, okay? So it doesn't mean that this isn't holy. It doesn't have the sanctification, the degree as high as this area. Can't have toilets in this area. And so they would go to the mikvah. The ones that are qualified will come back through the tunnel, come up the stairway, go back in and wait for the knock on the door. But the ones that are disqualified would come back to the tunnel, go down, enter the tunnel discovered by Charles Wilson, where there's three levels of benches along the southern wall. It's a quarantine chamber that these priests will stay there till the gates of the temple are open, go down, turn. They're in Warren's tunnel he discovered, and just past that area we believe is the location for the Tati gate. Okay, so piecing those things together. One of the cisterns, in fact, two of the cisterns are T-shaped. And back in following the 1967 Six-Day War, you know, Jerusalem was the old city was destroyed by the Jordanians. The archeologists, they were going to rebuild. They were going to bring the bulldozers in, just clear everything away and rebuild the Jewish quarter. The archeologists came to them and they said, wait a minute, we have a great opportunity. We can go back and see what Jerusalem was like before. So they go back and where are they at? They're at Jerusalem at the time of 70 Common Era when the Romans destroyed the city. They found great mansions that were owned by the priests. They found the evidence where they were burned. They found the whole neighborhood was of priestly homes. In fact, we believe one of these homes was the home probably of Ananias the high priest. And so, you know, that's exciting. There was a young archaeologist that worked with Professor Avigad. His name was Professor Ronnie Reich. Now, Ronnie Reich is no longer a young professor. He has his doctorate from Haifa University, and he's the leading expert on the mikvaot, the immersion chambers. He, out of all of Israel, worldwide, he is recognized as Israel's leading authority on this. Now, he can't go on top of the Temple Mount and take measurements. He can't examine. He can't go down into these cisterns and take a look and prove. However, what they found in the Jewish quarter when they rebuilt under Professor Avigad, what they found was in the priestly homes, they had these square-shaped, T-shaped cisterns, not cisterns, but they were mikvaot. They had stairs in them. So what Ronnie Reich, and you can find this, is published by the Israel Exploration Society. He has an article on 2 probable mikvaot on the Temple Mount. All right, one is larger, one is smaller. These mikvaot are actually spoken of in the Mishnah. What we're told is that when people would enter through the holy passageways, and so they're coming up from the south, and they're going to come up a tunnel, they come out, before they enter the holy courtyards, or the more holy, the inner courtyards, they must immerse. So we believe the bigger one was the mikvah for the men. The smaller one was the mikvah for the women. Next to it, there is a whole series of conduits. Okay, so the conduits are going to run parallel to each other. And then we have also running parallel, this is going from the east to the west, or west to the east. And then you have going north and south, cross conduits. Now these were found and documented by Charles Wilson, Charles Warren, and all these guys. What we're told in the Mishnah is that next to the mikvaot, that there were toilets. They're exactly where they're described. Coming up from the holy passageway, we have a mikvah here for the men, we have a mikvah here for the women, and then we have the toilets here. If you're in the inner courtyard, there are no toilets. So what we're told in the Mishnah is that if one has to go to the restroom, then they come out and they go to the toilets outside, but if they have a bowel movement, they have to immerse. If they just pass water, they have to wash their hands and feet before they can enter back in. Now, what I'm trying to explain is that we have many, many ancient documents, Josephus, we have the Mishnah, Midot, Tamid, Yoma, all that tell us details about the temple. We have the scripture. And all of these things we're discovering exactly where the buildings, where the mikvahot, where the chambers, where the tunnels. We can, at this point, identify, I'm going to say almost 50 different buildings, where they were precisely. And, it's the hand of God. It's not something that we're making up. We find the evidence, and God opens the door, brings the right authorities to be able to identify something, and everything's coming together. So that's basically my life for the last 40 years. It's the throne of God, okay? We have several passages. I'll read one. This is Ezekiel. Ezekiel in chapter 43, in verse 6. It says, then I heard him speaking to me from the temple. The him here is God. While a man stood beside me, and he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. Okay? I'll go to Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 12. In Jeremiah 17:12, a glorious high throne from the beginning is the place of our temple, of our sanctuary. We could go to the book of Genesis, to Bereshit chapter 3. It says that God created a garden eastward. Eastward from where? I mean, you have to have a reference point. Now, the Jews call the location, the Holy of Holies, that there is a stone there. The stone is called the Even Shetiyah. It means the foundation stone. That's where the ark sat. We have that numbers of passages. We have the Holy of Holies is the place of the chariot of God. It literally calls it in 1 Chronicles 28, the Merkavah, the chariot. Okay, but we also have that it is the throne. And so we have this location where God placed his throne on earth. And so the temple itself is called the house of Kedusha. Mikdash comes from the word kadosh, which means holy. Kedusha, when man was created in the image of God. But when man sinned, man was no longer in the image of God. Man had been diminished. And not only did we no longer have holiness, we lost basically the concept of it. So the purpose of the temple, I believe, is not only that it's the throne of God and the place that we approach God, but it is the place that He teaches us how to approach. And He teaches us about what is holiness. And so everything in the temple is geared towards instructing, teaching, and walking in that. And so how important is the temple? Solomon, I think, he said it very well. He said, wherever you are, face towards this location. Face towards, because it's the throne of God. It's not because Solomon built a fancy building, it's because it's the house of God on earth. And then for non-Jews, for Jews, it is equal that we are to face towards it, we're to pray before it, and we're to believe because we're approaching God as our King. Okay, first off, the temple does not use the water from the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring is south of the temple, down in the city of David. The water for the temple, we have three sources for this. One is the collect rainwater. Okay, so you go down to Masada and you see that the technology they have for collecting huge amounts of water is remarkable. Secondly, there is south of Bethlehem what is called Solomon's Pools. This is going to long predate Yeshua, going to at least the Hasmonean period. Conduits, massive. I've been down to see them. Have you ever seen these?
Not in person.
Oh man, it is mind-boggling. Just picture this: you have three of these, and you could probably put in the largest one, I'm going to say 50 Olympic-sized swimming pools. I mean, the volume of water. Now they built a conduit system, an aqueduct, that came, and the engineering was absolutely remarkable. And it brings the water into the temple. Herod comes along later. He repairs what is there and adds a larger aqueduct. And later on, the Romans will come back with another. You can still see up until the 1900s, the aqueduct, the water system, was still in use. And in fact, if you go up on the Temple Mount, you can follow the line of the aqueducts, okay, underground. Now, I'll tell you in a moment how you can follow them, but they're charted first. All of this was charted by those explorers from the Palestine Exploration Fund. And we can see where they are because there are little manholes, and they're all in a line, and they follow exactly the path. And I can take you up on the Temple Mount, and I can walk. We can walk directly 5 minutes, and you'll be able to go by yourself and follow the conduits wherever they go, and they're exactly where they're charted out by the PEF individuals. Now, they have identified various cisterns. The oldest datable cistern is going to be from the Hasmonean period. We have two. How we know they're from the Hasmonean period, Shimon Gibson, and I'm trying to think, I know him, but I'm trying to think of his name. They wrote a paper on the oldest datable cisterns. They are kidney-shaped. Now, these are found down in the Shpila Valley. In the Hasmonean cities, in that period, they made their conduits exactly the same. And so they are able to date that. It's a long, long before the Romans ever were on the scene. We have cisterns that are being built. We have cisterns that we know are from the First Temple period. We just can't date them. We have cisterns that would be from the time of Herod. We have gigantic water sources. Now we have one cistern that is mentioned in the tractate Midot. Okay, that's the measurements tractate. And it tells us that there is a chamber on the southeastern corner of the inner courtyard. It's within a building that's called the Beit of Tinas. It's a huge building, but this chamber is called the Lishkat Gola, or if you do the pronunciation a different way, if you have the vowels different, it's called the Lishkat Gula. Okay, so Gula means like a bowl, the chamber of the bowl. Gola is the chamber of the dispersion. So there's two different opinions. The first opinion is that the returnees from Babylon built this chamber. Lehm Rittmeyer goes with that. Maimonides in Mishneh Torah, another of the rabbinical writings, calls it the Gula, the Gula, the roll or the bowl. Now that's very interesting because the chamber, we're told, had a large wheel, and the wheel made a lot of noise. It is what is called in Hebrew a mukni. This is literally what it's called. It means just a machine, but it pumped the water up. Now it says that it sat over a particular cistern that was a fixed cistern. Fixed cistern, what does that mean? I worked with a lady back years ago. She was the leading authority on the water sources of Jerusalem at the time. She, in fact, surveyed the Gihon Spring. She was adamant the Gihon Spring does not supply water to the Temple Mount. It is independent, but this well, fixed well, she said, what does this mean? It means it's a well that does not require rainwater. It's a water that does not require the aqueducts to bring water from a different location to this location, that down inside this well, there is a spring. Now, that spring, they have a name for it. They call it the Ein Atam, not the Gihon, okay? A different independent source. It's important that the temple not rely on an exterior source that they cannot guarantee, because the temple, it did historically at times act as a fortress. During the period right before the Romans arrived, and even after they arrived, there was a civil war going on between three different but the zealot armies. And so one of them occupied the temple. Actually, two armies did, one in the inner courts, one in the outer courts. And it's a fort. So if you have a fort, how do you beat a fort? You cut off its water. Temple had to have its own water supply. And that's why in the 1800s, when the representatives from Great Britain came and say, we want to give you a water system. That's why they said, yes, you can survey it. And what they found was 90% of the water was on the Temple Mount. It's not possible. I mean, absolutely impossible. And before I go into that, I mean, in conversations with Eilat Mazar, Eli Shukron, the Dan Bahat, the leading archaeologists, every one of them say it's impossible. So the entire city of David, it is a ridge of the slope of Mount Moriah, the lower slopes of Mount Moriah. It is the top of that ridge is only 14 acres. The Temple Mount is 35 acres. When Solomon first began to build it, it was a ridge. And what he did was he built platforms and he broadened the area to make an area large enough for the temple, because the temple requires a huge amount of space. We have, I know that those that are putting forth the theory that it's down at the city of David, they say, oh, well, the Temple Mount was really the Fortress Antonia. And they had, and they say there was a legion there. Actually, the word in Greek is identified as a cohort. A cohort is about 600 men at max, whereas a legion is 6,000. I don't have any problem with 6,000, okay? They have a number of 10,000. 6,000, 10,000. The Fortress Antonia in itself was big enough to house that. How many people do we have that are in the temple? On a daily basis, we have the letter of Aristeas. It says there were 700 priests. And it says it's not counting all of the individuals. So if you have 700 priests, you have 700 Levites, that's 1,400. How many worshipers do you have on a daily basis? Well, you're going to go into the thousands, literally into the thousands. But let's go to the festivals. We have the command for the people, they are to journey to Jerusalem for the festivals, right? Josephus records numbers for us. Now these numbers, he's going to list the number of lambs that were killed. This is in Jewish Wars, Book 6. He lists the numbers of lambs that were killed for one Passover, and you have to multiply that by a minimum number of 10 and a maximum number of 20. What you end up with coming to that particular Passover is over 2 million individuals. That's unbelievable. How could you fit into this ridge with only 14 areas if you went from the bottom to the top? And what they're saying is it's right above the Gihon Spring. Okay, so for, what are we talking about in reality? We're talking about something in their version is the size of a large department store. Now that's for the temple building, the altar, that's for the inner courtyard, the court of the women, the outer courtyard, and all the buildings that you have associated. All right? So we have the cubit. The cubit's the measurement. All right, what we've discovered is there were 3 different cubits that we know of right now that were used on the Temple Mount. One was discovered by Benjamin Mazar and by Leon Rittmeyer. It's called the royal cubit. It was the original wall around the temple was called the royal cubit, 20.67 inches. We discovered in the Mishnah, it tells us, as well as in the book of Ezekiel, that they used a 6 handbreadth cubit. And then we also have a reference to a 5 handbreadth cubit. We discovered the size of these cubits. The 6 handbreadth is 23.04 cubits. The 5 handbreadths is 19.2 cubits. The cubit, if we're going to put the temple at the city of David, we're going to have a cubit that's less than 6 inches, which is virtually impossible because the smallest cubit ever discovered in the world was 14 inches. So you have to deny math. You have that the size of the Temple Mount before the Hasmoneans expanded it to the south, and Herod expanded it further to the south and to the west and to the north. The size of the cubit was 500 cubits by 500 cubits. That's 861 feet on each side. Guess what? You don't have 861 feet going across the top of the city of David. So what you're saying is to do what they are claiming mathematically is impossible. It doesn't fit the measurements. It doesn't fit the demands of the space you need for all the people that are coming, the size of the buildings. The altar alone was 32 cubits square. That was a 6 handbreadths cubit. That means the altar is 61 feet on each side and has a ramp that's 61 feet. What you have in their temple is an altar that is about 10 foot by 12 foot. And it is impossible. You have to deny all the information about the temple. You have to deny everything we have in the Bible, everything that we have in the Jewish writings of the Mishnah, in the Talmud, everything that we have there, everything that we have in Josephus, because Josephus, if you follow out what he's saying, he's describing a gigantic, an enormous temple, not a little box. Well, first off, there's two parts to that. And let me read it. This is in Matthew chapter 24. All right, Matthew 24. And verse 1, then Yeshua went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Yeshua said to them, do you not see all these things? As surely I said to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Now, if we put it in the context of the preceding verse, he's talking about the buildings. And that's true. There is not a building that's standing above ground. There are places I can take you to. I can show you traces of the temple on the surface, but there's no stone standing on top of another. But I want to go to another passage. This is in Luke 19. In Luke 19, verse 41, talking about Yeshua. Now, as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known each you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side. It's talking about the Romans. And level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you, meaning the city of Jerusalem, one stone upon another. Wait a second. We have ruins. We can go to the third wall. And the third wall, you're taller than me. I guarantee you, I would have to help you get on the third wall because there's stone after stone after stone. We can go to the Herodian mansions. We can go to the Herodian mansions, and we've got 2-story buildings all the way up to the ceiling that are still remaining from the ruins after the Romans destroyed the city. We can go to the burnt house. There's places all over Jerusalem. We can go to the western palaces. We can see the foundations of some of the towers that Herod had. And so, am I supposed to say, okay, Matthew 24 says not one stone upon another, that's accurate, and I agree, it's accurate, but Luke 19, that's not. We're not going to look at that. Yeshua was mistaken in that one, because we have archaeology, we have verified proof that we have all of these locations. What I submit to you is not one stone upon another is an expression, meaning total ruin. The city was in total destruction. We often say, he ate the whole thing, or he did, the whole Megillah or whatever. We use expressions that mean, wow, it was big, it was massive, but we're not being literal in what we're saying. And so we've got ruins, and the expression that Yeshua gave, Josephus did exactly the same thing. Josephus came in and said that you couldn't even tell that a city was there. He said that about Jerusalem. Well, my goodness, you can. And you can go to YouTube and you can look at all of these runs that are being uncovered, that are being documented. You can go and you can visit these places because it was not meant as a literal, there would not be a stone upon another stone. Besides that, the walls that they are referring to are not the walls of the temple up above. They are the retaining walls. What are the retaining walls for? The retaining walls, they were building up these platforms. Originally we had a ridge. And so they had to build. That's why it took Solomon so long. The first temple was not finished till the reign of King Hezekiah. because they had to build, and they're building up, and they had to put a wall here, a retaining wall, so that it would not just first rain be down in the valleys. And that's what they are. And so a lot of people follow this theory that it was down at the city of David, but it does not hold water, will not work. Eloy Mazar told Rico Cortez and I had gone, we had a meeting with her. This is back several years ago, and she said she went to one of the individuals that was putting forth this theory and said, look, it doesn't work. It won't work. It is impossible. And, if you talk to the archaeologists, basically, most of them will just laugh because it's such a ridiculous idea. And if you go and you look, it'll never work. It'll never work. The evidence is there. The evidence that shows that the Temple Mount is exactly where we say the Temple Mount is located. The archaeologists agree. The men from the Palestine Exploration Fund, they agreed 100 years ago. We have the rabbis agree. All the texts agree. There is ample evidence. It is evident that the temple, we found the evidence that this is the temple. We know exactly where the temple building was located. Now, people like to say, oh, there's a conspiracy. You need to get to the bottom of it. The actual truth, I don't believe that everybody that thinks this, I think people are caught away not knowing the facts. They're caught away and they run with it. But the ones that are putting it forth, I believe it is anti-Semitic. It is a way of saying, oh, the Jews are wrong. The Jews have been lying to us. The archaeologists are wrong. They've been lying to us. They all have a conspiracy. It is not a matter of their reputations. Their reputation is that they are presenting the truth. You can go to any number of locations, the libraries, the Israel Exploration Society, you can go to academia, you can go to Hebrew University, any of the universities, and they have the documentation. Here's what we found. Here are the measurements, here are the pictures, here are the artifacts, here are all of these things. The story tells the truth. It's very, very, and the Muslims love it. The Muslims, because they're trying to deny that God's temple was on the Temple Mount. Back in the early 1900s, they didn't. In their own publications, they said this is the location of Solomon's temple, later on built on by Herod. But politics have changed. They now say, no, it's a Muslim site. So they love the theory it's down at the city of David. And people need to know, you support that. Number one, you're supporting a lie. You're supporting a distortion. You're supporting something that is anti-Semitic and is doing harm, not only to the Jewish people, it's doing harm to the kingdom of God.